one of the particular images I wanted to talk to you about was Gustave Caillebotte's Paris Street Rainy Day, which you have written about in the past, and you were also at the
the Art Institute of Chicago.
Yeah, yeah. Where, in fact, this
painting is.
Yeah.
I used to walk past it nearly every day.
Yeah. I actually came upon it completely by chance. I didn't realise that it was there. I was in Chicago on a conference, and I was walking around the gallery, and there it was. And I've used it for many years in my teaching.
Well, certainly it was that way for me as well. I mean, when I was first at the Art Institute of Chicago, my museum, my education at that point, hadn't really included Caillebotte. I mean, I went to college in the 1960s, and at that point, when one talked about Impressionism, you didn't discuss it in sufficient detail to include Caillebotte. I don't think people really felt that he mattered very much.
No, he was very much considered, I think, a very minor
player. I mean, that's how the history was read up until Kirk Vonnegut did his show.
Yeah.
What was that, 1978 maybe, or 77,
Yeah. So tell me about the image, when you first saw it, when you first sort of discovered it yourself, what was your impression of it?
Well, I was extremely impressed by it. I mean, it's one of the collection highlights in Chicago, where they also have Seurat's painting roughly the same size of the island of the Grand Jatte. I guess it's the Seurat's. Those were the two parentheses for their very, very important collection of late 19th century French painting, and so I wanted to find out more about Caillebotte, and also, I think it was the kind of picture as an experience that kind of disturbed everything that I brought with me as learning. By which I mean to say that it's very impressive. It's life-size. You almost feel as if you could walk away into it. That you could just step into the picture, or the people that are in it are going to step out of it, and so on and so forth. So it has that kind of intimacy about it on the because of Caillebotte's extraordinary competence, especially with perspective, and yet, I had learned that Impressionism was about turning your back on all of that, and I had learned that Impressionism was about works that were painted very stenographically and quickly, and therefore tended to be sort of portable in scale. And here was, this museum in Chicago that had this very, very large work by an artist I had never heard of, who was associated with the Impressionists, but seemed to be doing everything that they weren't. And that, that piqued my curiosity, I think, and to want to know more and more about Caillebotte. And I, thanks to the attention he got beginning in the late 70s, I mean, I think it totally transformed, people's understanding of that period.
What you say about the being surprised by the scale of it, that was my impression as well when I first saw it. I was taken aback by how it's quite a theatrical scale, but it's also I think of it as being quite a photographic work.
Right.
Do you think that would be a fair comment?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, when you or I say photographic today, and we walk outside and maybe there's 1,000 pictures being taken just within a block of us here in New York, on cell phones and so on and so forth. I mean, at the time, photographic was entirely different. I mean, it was an art form and a form of artisanship itself. So yes, I do think it's photographic that way,
and particularly photographic of of that time, in the sense
and given the limitation at that time in terms of photography's inability to work color yet, and its limitations when it came to showing movement. I mean, the sort of stayed space. I mean, one has it with the picture is so empty that it's occurred to me that his hope, like that of a photographer, would have been, to concentrate on his scene without the interruption of pedestrians passing by.
Yeah.
And that, in the process of being there, he nevertheless had to deal with the reality of the fact that there would be some people out on a rainy day, interfering slightly with them.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned also about the perspective, and I've recently been to this intersection in Paris. One of the interesting things about when you go there, I mean, the lamp is in the same place, which is quite interesting. But the most interesting thing about the space itself is that it actually is smaller than it looks in Caillebotte's rendering of it. So there's an accentuation of the perspective that you get, I think, in Caillebotte's rendering of that particular physical place.
Do you think that he intended that, or was just sort of by accident that it happened that way?
I don't know.
It's so hard to judge. I mean, when you look at a photograph and you get a sort of an imaginary idea of the scale, and then when you go to the actual place, maybe years later, you'll find that there's an inconsistency between what you saw in a book or a magazine, and then where you are. And I wonder whether that's about the discrepancy between the two images, or whether that somehow has to do with your expectations and anticipation and so on. I think more complicated than we could know, but
I think it's maybe that's absolutely right. I mean, for me, when I first saw the scene, I thought this looks like it's a major intersection of boulevards in Paris. But it's they're actually reasonably small streets. They still are part of that, as far as I know, that sort of Haussmann redesigning of Paris. It is near the Pont Europe and the Gare Saint-Lazare.
That's it.
It's kind of in that area. So it was part of that reconfiguration of Paris. I wonder that. The scale. I mean, maybe it is perception, but if it's not, I wonder if the scale that Caillebotte gives the scene has something to do with the monumentality that he sees. There is this tension, I think, in impressions between a kind of a monumental, often monumental.
I mean, if you went to Paris and you stood where Degas presumably stood to make the Place de la Concorde picture with the man and his daughters and their dog and stuff walking across it, would you have the same response, or would you think that Degas' rendition was closer to what you felt if you were standing there?
In terms of the scene that it depicts, you've written something quite interesting about what you've called a standoff, I think.
Oh, between these people on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
I always, I've had a tendency all of my career to be interested in the humor in art, which got me off to a rather bad start. Because believe it or not, in the 1960s and 70s and even in the 80s, I mean, if you spoke to serious people about that and said, well, there's a sense of humor here, it didn't correspond to their very, very strict idea that art should be something quite serious, But
that it lacks intellectual depth if it's humorous in some way.
But I thought that was altogether wrong-headed, and eventually, thinking would change, and it has. So in this particular painting, I took amusement from how he had captured what I thought was a very typical moment in Paris, where the sidewalks are rather narrow, and very often as you're walking down them, there'll be oblivious people heading towards you, who would push you out underneath an oncoming bus, or they wouldn't think of their surroundings. So I mean, there is a sense in which at least the couple walking down the sidewalk are oblivious to where they are. They're talking to one another, and you can see that they're oblivious, just like you can see where they are.
Yeah, they're so distracted there.
And I find that gives a special charm to the picture.
Yeah.
One of the other things that set me on a bit of a wild goose chase about the picture was my inability to come up with any other images that I knew of the modern umbrella. I mean, I thought, what images could there are pictures by Tiepolo and things where people have sunshades. And
I was going to say Monet.
There's pictures of but I mean, this idea of sort of a collapsible, waterproof umbrella and so on and so forth. How come, if that had been invented, how come nobody ever bothered to depict it? And it took a while before it dawned on me to, that nobody, like a photographer, couldn't be working on a rainy day. Yeah. I think there is in the Library of Congress, I think they have a picture of, Lincoln giving his second inaugural address or something, and the day was raining and there's somebody with an umbrella there or something like that. But it's just because the very condition that would require an umbrella is a condition that would, at that point in time, discourage the creation of images.
When I teach my course to first years on modernity and modernism being the expression of modernity, one of my favourite images to talk about is Gustave Caillebotte's Paris Street Rainy Day. And another art historian who has written about this, Charles Stuckey, says that he talks about there is what he said is a typically French face-off that happens in that image. Do you know the part that I'm talking about with the couple walking towards, and there is another figure that you can just see the back of? You've actually written a lot about French culture. What are your thoughts about that idea of this face-off?
Well, if by that you mean a kind of cross-class experience, I mean, I think that painting in general, of course, is a comment on the transformation of Paris in the mid-19th century. It's rationalization. I mean, I think that it's a painting, its grayness itself is meant to be about a certain form of urban monotony, actually. But what breaks up the monotony are not only the umbrellas, which bring you down to everyday life and the experience of things like rain, but also the people that you see, the woman, the man, the working class man, and the exchange of urban life as a kind of a crucible of cross-class experience. And one of the things, of course, that so much Impressionist painting is about is looking and being a part of a modern urban crowd. And people have talked about the flaneur, and many people have talked about the gendering of the flaneur, that, this is a form of male gazing. But what I've always thought is that actually this emphasis on a culture of looking and seeing really suggests that everybody has the ability to be kind of part of the story and part of the looking. And so instead, though the person who looks is in a sense empowered, but I don't think that this culture actually limits that looking to privileged men. Quite the opposite. I think that what we understand is that especially when you've got city life or you've got entertainment culture, you really have a crowd that is cross-class and also of both genders. And you'll see, I wrote in the 19th century about a very strange phenomenon, which were public visits to the Paris morgue, which was had a big, huge plate glass window, and 20, 30,000 people in a day would walk through the morgue and look at the dead bodies that were exposed behind plate glass window. And in all the representations of the morgue, which, by the way, people used to refer to as the free theater of the city, in all the representations you had women, you had children, you had maids, you had dogs. Now, people have asked me, well, do you really think dogs were there? And I actually think there probably were dogs, and anybody who knows Paris knows that there are dogs everywhere in Paris. But really what the dog means is that this is le tout Paris. This is all of Paris. This is not just the elite. That these dogs or these children are there to kind of stand in for the fact that city life is a spectacle for everybody and not simply a kind of replaying of elite culture. So I think that kind of art also, and Caillebotte was very aware of putting different classes in his paintings. The Pont de l'Europe also
that one, yeah.
is very much about, I would say, a cross-class experience. And again, whenever
the dog is in that.
and the dog is in that, exactly. And I think when people see class, they immediately see then inequality. But I think one of the interesting things about the 19th century was that class also, for the first time, meant actually all of society being in the same place, which is already a kind of major shift from a kind of pre-modern, idea of a society which wasn't so much class-based as status-based, and where, people of different statuses would never occupy the same place or, be thought to appreciate the same form of culture. That was kind of unheard of. And I think what's really interesting in the 19th century is it really shakes up these ideas, and people really, I'm not saying that there's great equality between classes, but I think that there is a shared culture for the first time, which is what mass society is all about, and that's kind of new. And I think Caillebotte had his finger on that in many ways.
It's kind of reflected also in someone like Emile Durkheim, who talks about the way that society, the functionalist idea of society arises at that particular kind of time as well, isn't it? It's this idea. There's I think it's Ford Madox Brown, that work called Work, which is in Manchester, is this very idealized image of, it's even painted in a kind of a vignette that's pyramid in shape, with the upper classes at the top and the middle classes and the navvies kind of, then down at the bottom. And it's very much that, the idea of society working almost like a machine.
Now, Durkheim, though, of course, was very stressed about all these changes in modern life, and he wrote his great book, Suicide, using, in fact, statistics from the Paris morgue. He believed that there was more suicide in modern life, which no one has actually proven to be true. But why Durkheim was interested in suicide is because he thought that people were essentially alone in these crowds, that essentially that these were forms of alienation, and that while there was a mass society, people nevertheless were so disconnected that essentially they killed themselves. And so he talked about it and developed the social theory called anomie, which is essentially one of the great modern problems, being in a crowd and being alone. I would disagree with that, and I think that, the way to understand that best is to say, if you look at France, for example, there's a lot of revolutionary activity in France over the course of the 19th century. And then after the Paris Commune, basically there are no more revolutions. Some people have said, well, why? And they say because the forces of repression became so much more effective and efficient. And that's one way to think about it. But another way to think about it is that actually people did start to participate more in cultural life and had kind of greater belonging and greater satisfaction. So I think rather than see the social as a kind of glass half empty, which is the kind of Durkheimian way of looking at this mass society, I'm kind of been much more interested in seeing the glass as half full. And I think people, even Marxists like Walter Benjamin, for example, had their finger on the idea that not all of this culture was alienating, and that there was really something in it. And of course, I think for Benjamin, film was the form that would unleash the kind of democratic nature of, it was a kind of a visual form of the democratic transformations of society in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I think there is something to be said about that. So that's kind of where my interests and orientations tend to lie.